In February 2022, the world watched in shock as the Russian invasion of Ukraine began. While international leaders mobilized and citizens sought to escape the conflict, a team of journalists from the Associated Press, AP, made a decision that would change their lives. Led by the renowned Ukrainian reporter Mstyslav Chernov, the team decided to stay in the strategic city of Mariupol in southern Ukraine. At that time, few imagined this would become one of the war's most brutal scenes. Mariupol, a coastal city with about 500,000 residents before the war, was known for its maritime history and economic importance. But it quickly became synonymous with horror and resistance. The first Russian attack arrived on February 24th, the official date of the invasion's start. From there, the city began to be surrounded by Russian armed forces, completely isolating its residents. Chernov and his team had already covered previous conflicts, but nothing prepared them for what was coming. They were about to witness firsthand a brutal siege that would last weeks and result in thousands of deaths. In those early days, there was still some communication with the outside. But as attacks increased, internet and power networks began to fail, cutting Mariupol off from the rest of the world. The AP team managed to capture the initial moments of the invasion: armored vehicles entering the city, explosions echoing through residential neighborhoods, and civilians running desperately in search of shelter. The Ukrainian government tried to organize evacuations, but constant bombardments made any attempt at escape difficult. The journalists realized this might be their last chance to leave the city or to stay and record the truth. Mstyslav, a Ukrainian citizen born and raised in the country, felt the weight of the decision personally. Leaving Mariupol meant abandoning his people during an extremely vulnerable moment. Staying, however, was risking his own life. With cameras in hand and bulletproof vests on, they chose to remain. They would be the only international journalists documenting in real time what was happening inside the besieged city. The last diplomatic flight out of Ukraine left a few hours later. It was the symbolic moment when the country stood alone against the invasion. For Chernov, this wasn't just news. It was the reality of his own home. The streets of Mariupol began to empty. Stores closed, cars abandoned, children crying. Each detail was carefully recorded by the team, who knew these images would have immeasurable historical value. In the center of the city, the first signs of collapse appeared. Hospitals without medicine, empty gas stations, and families gathered in makeshift shelters in building staircases. It was the beginning of something few could imagine. A siege that would last weeks and shock the world with its devastating images. And the AP team was there to show every second. In the first days within the besieged city, Mstyslav Chernov and his Associated Press team already faced extreme difficulties working in a war zone. Every movement needed to be calculated, each captured image valuable. As Russian attacks intensified, Mariupol turned into a battlefield of silent struggles, not only between soldiers but also against time. The journalists' priority was to document what was happening before it was erased. The first hospitals hit began appearing in international reports. One located in the city center suffered severe damage after a bombing injured dozens and left many without adequate medical care. Chernov and his team were among the first to enter the hospital shortly after the attack. The scene was desolate. Cracked walls, scattered medical equipment, and patients trying to survive with minimal resources. Among the victims were pregnant women, elderly people, and children. Some screamed in pain, others remained silent, looking around as if searching for an explanation for the horror descending upon them. One particularly striking moment was the recording of a maternity ward directly hit by explosions. The footage showed destroyed hallways, overturned cribs, and mothers holding newborn babies amid the chaos. These scenes, although hard to watch, were essential to show the world the brutal reality of war. For the AP team, there was awareness that these images could change perceptions and even pressure governments to act. However, capturing these moments required courage. Right in the line of fire, the team faced the constant risk of airstrikes, stray bullets, and even arrest by Russian forces if discovered filming certain areas. Even so, the journalists pressed forward. With hidden or disguised cameras, they managed to capture details no one else recorded, which later became irrefutable evidence of atrocities committed during the war. Each day, the siege tightened further. Blocked roads, severed communications, and the lack of clean water and food increased tension among residents. And the AP team continued to document everything. The first reports of mass civilian deaths began emerging. Some reported bodies being left in the streets with no one to remove them. Others told stories of entire families wiped out in a single attack. Chernov knew that by transmitting these facts, he carried immense responsibility. Each image, each testimony, was a voice representing thousands of people trapped between bullets and bombs. The impact of these initial reports began echoing beyond Ukraine. Newsrooms around the world received the videos and photos, turning them into front-page headlines and evening news segments. But for the inhabitants of Mariupol, none of that mattered much. While the world watched, they lived, and each second seemed like an eternity, each breath a miracle. With the first days in Mariupol already marked by constant attacks and shocking images, Mstyslav Chernov and his team began to understand they were facing something far beyond a typical journalistic coverage. There, in that besieged city, there was no safe newsroom, no regular working hours. Every minute was a battle against fear, hunger, and exhaustion, and above all, against silence trying to erase the truth. The team's routine boiled down to an unrelenting cycle. Waking up early, checking if they still had communication with the outside world, planning movements, and heading out onto the streets with cameras ready to capture the harshest realities of war. They slept in makeshift shelters, often inside hospitals or basements of abandoned buildings. Nights were interrupted by explosions and the distant sound of heavy artillery, making rest almost non-existent. Chernov knew that each step outside the shelter could be the last. Yet, he insisted on being where people needed to be heard, in food lines, in makeshift medical posts, in homes damaged by bombings. The recording equipment was protected as though it were an extension of their own bodies. Each member of the team had a defined role. While one recorded, another observed the surroundings, ensuring no one was in immediate danger. It was impossible to predict when a new explosion would occur. Sometimes it came from the sky, other times from afar, without warning. The only certainty was that, stepping out of shelter, no one knew whether they would return. The team relied on short-range radios and cell phones with weak signals. When they managed to send material, it brought temporary relief. But soon came the worry. What if the next connection took days? Despite all these difficulties, they maintained the discipline of recording every detail. Not just the major tragedies, but also the small human moments. A child crying, an elderly person praying, a doctor wiping the face of an injured person. Beyond external pressures from combat, there was physical and emotional wear. The journalists dealt with accumulated sleep deprivation, irregular meals, and the constant anguish of witnessing so much suffering without being able to help directly. Once, during an attempt to evacuate civilians, Chernov and his cameraman filmed an entire family running under gunfire. The father carried a girl in his arms, while the mother held a newborn wrapped in a dust-covered cloth. This moment was broadcast live and seen by millions. To the world, it was a shocking image. To those present, it was just one of hundreds of similar cases. Each day, the line between reporter and witness became thinner. Chernov was not just an observer, he was part of the story, and that weighed heavily on his shoulders. Despite all the tension, the team kept focused. Each recording, each interview, each second filmed was a form of resistance. It was proof that Mariupol still breathed, even under ashes and rubble. In the dusty corridors of a makeshift shelter, between muffled screams and heavy breathing, a scene repeated itself every day. Injured, frightened children unable to understand why their world was collapsing. Mstyslav Chernov and his Associated Press team began recording these moments more frequently. It wasn't easy to film, but they knew that children were the cruelest portrait of war. Innocent victims caught in a conflict they did not choose to live. In one of the still-functioning hospitals, they found a 6-year-old girl named Alina. Her arm was wrapped in improvised cloth, and her eyes, fixed on the floor, seemed to carry all the fear in the world. She had lost partial hearing after an explosion near her house. Her mother, visibly shaken, tried to calm her, but her hands trembled uncontrollably. It was hard to protect someone when everything around seemed to explode. Chernov made sure to capture this moment respectfully. He didn't want to exploit the family's pain, but rather to show the world that even children were in the line of fire, literally. Reports multiplied. Babies being born in underground shelters, children separated from parents during attacks, entire families fleeing in torn clothes and broken boots, unsure of where to go. The AP team recorded a particularly impactful moment. A small child, alone in the middle of the street, crying while holding a damaged doll. The building where she lived had been hit minutes earlier. There was no way not to be moved. Each image carried a story of loss, fear, and resistance, and each one required courage to capture under constant risk of new attacks. Beyond direct scenes, the journalists also heard testimonies from parents who, despite extreme pressure, did everything possible to keep hope alive. One explained how he taught his son to hide, yet also to dream of a better future. There was a school that, before the war, was full of life and color. After the bombings, only broken walls and overturned desks remained. Still, some children stayed there, sitting on the floor, trying to learn anything at all. Chernov filmed a teacher giving class amidst the ruins, speaking firmly, almost stubbornly. She said, "If we stop teaching, they win." It was a phrase that echoed far beyond those ruins. The team also followed an attempt to evacuate sick children. Doctors improvised ambulances using private cars, and the journalists accompanied them, recording each uncertain step along the blocked road. The path was dangerous. Every exit had to be negotiated with soldiers on both sides. At times, the team was stopped and threatened by Russian forces demanding they delete the recorded images. Even in the face of this, the team persisted, because they knew that each child saved, each image shown, was a victory over forgetting. And without witnesses, the truth could be erased forever. As the days passed in Mariupol, the war scenario transformed into something even more desperate. The once lively and colorful city now became a tangled mess of rubble, silence, and bodies. Mstyslav Chernov and his Associated Press team started to realize the number of deaths was rising alarmingly. Overcrowded hospitals couldn't handle the injured, and burials became a tragic routine. It was common to find bodies on sidewalks, covered in dirty sheets, or simply abandoned in front of collapsed buildings. People no longer had strength or time to bury their dead with dignity. This is when mass graves emerged, makeshift locations where bodies were placed on top of each other, without coffins, ceremonies, or often identification. Chernov recorded one of these scenes in a park previously a family meeting spot. Now it was an improvised cemetery. Local workers, wearing makeshift masks and torn gloves, dug enormous holes, almost like wells. Bodies were wrapped in black and white plastic, carried by tired and frightened men. Often, they cried while lowering each body into the cold, wet earth. As Mariupol burned under constant bombardments and attacks, something outside the city began to gain strength. The images captured by the Associated Press team. Mstyslav Chernov and his colleagues knew they were witnessing one of the most brutal periods in recent history. Each recording was proof, each photograph, a silent denunciation against the horror unfolding far from the eyes of the world. But transmitting these images was not simple. With unreliable communication and the constant threat of being discovered by Russian forces, the team had to use creative strategies to send the material abroad. At times, they relied on portable satellites. At others, they depended on intermittent internet connections or even short radio messages. Each transmission was a race against time. When the first videos reached the AP newsroom in Kiev, and later the international offices, the impact was immediate. The images were shocking, hard to watch, but impossible to ignore. Soon, scenes of the bombed hospital, the destroyed maternity ward, and the mass graves started appearing in headlines across major global outlets. From BBC to CNN, from the New York Times to Le Monde. Social media also became a powerful ally. Posts about Mariupol went viral. Millions watched the footage and reacted with outrage, sadness, and often, helplessness. European and American governments began citing the AP reports specifically in their official statements. The recordings became part of the international political discourse, used as evidence in formal condemnations of Russia. The increased coverage also generated global pressure. The European Union and the United States accelerated economic sanctions against Russian leaders, and humanitarian organizations intensified efforts to assist Ukrainian civilians. In addition, the videos served as the basis for international investigations into possible war crimes. International law experts began analyzing the footage as legal evidence for future trials. For the residents of Mariupol, however, this reaction felt distant. While the world debated politics and diplomacy, they fought to find food, water, and shelter. Still, there was hope. Some civilians said they had seen their stories told on radio or foreign TV broadcasts. "At least someone is watching," said a woman to Chernov while holding her injured son's hand. That phrase summarized the greater purpose of journalism: to give voice to the invisible, to show what others try to hide, and to remind the world that even in the midst of chaos, people are living, suffering, and resisting. As the days passed in Mariupol, Mstyslav Chernov and his Associated Press team began to feel the effects not only physically but emotionally of the war. Being under constant threat changed people. Sleep became rare, dreams were invaded by explosions and screams, and even moments of rest were marked by tension. Chernov recalled that some nights he would wake up startled by the sound of a falling glass or wind hitting a door. His body was always on high alert, as if at any moment a bomb might fall. The physical exhaustion was visible. Lack of regular meals, little clean water, and an overload of adrenaline caused everyone to lose weight rapidly. Some even bled from their noses due to dehydration. In addition, there was the mental strain of constantly deciding what to film. Every choice seemed cruel. Record a mother crying beside her dead child, or help carry an injured person to shelter. Chernov admitted in later interviews that many times he felt like giving it all up and fleeing. But he knew that leaving Mariupol would mean abandoning thousands of untold stories. There were moments when the team discussed among themselves whether to continue or not. One reporter confessed to having panic attacks before going out onto the streets. Another said he could no longer distinguish between reality and nightmare. Yet they kept going, because they knew that every image captured was proof, and every recorded testimony was a story that needed to be told. The relationships within the team were also affected. Sometimes frustration and fatigue took over. There were arguments, emotional decisions, but they always ended with a silent agreement. "We have to keep going." Chernov, as team leader, took on an even more difficult role. He had to ensure everyone's safety, maintain focus on reporting, and deal with the guilt of being there while so many others died. One of the most striking moments occurred when one of the cameramen nearly got hit by a stray bullet. He stood frozen for minutes, trembling, until Chernov hugged him and said, "You're alive, and that's what matters." But not all battles were external. The biggest one was against their own hearts. How can a journalist remain objective in the face of such suffering? How can one avoid emotional involvement? Often, Chernov filmed a scene and, upon returning to shelter, would cry alone. He didn't want to show weakness to his colleagues, but he knew that inside, he was just a man watching his country collapse. Despite this, he found strength in small gestures. A child smiling after receiving a piece of chocolate, a doctor saving a life, a family reunited after days apart. These moments were like lights in the darkness. After hours traveling along a road filled with debris, soldiers, and fear, Mstyslav Chernov and his Associated Press team finally saw something that had seemed impossible for days: an open horizon free of explosions. They had made it. They crossed the besieged Mariupol, faced Russian checkpoints, and navigated extreme danger zones. And now they were out of the city. But each of their hearts still remained there, among the ruins and untold stories. Upon returning to the newsroom in Kiev, and then to the wider world, they brought more than equipment and recorded images. They carried real testimonies, silenced voices from the conflict, and proof that Mariupol resisted even when everything seemed lost. The recordings made during those 20 days would become part of a powerful documentary. 20 Days in Mariupol, a film that goes beyond war. It is a human portrait, a real-time cry for help. Chernov, who had already covered conflicts in other countries, said nothing had prepared him for this. "I never imagined I would see my own country under crossfire, my fellow citizens fleeing their homes as refugees. The documentary is not just about bombs and attacks. It is about difficult choices, about journalists who decided to stay when everyone else fled, about civilians who tried to preserve life even when everything seemed to end. It is about resistance in its purest form. When the world watched the footage, many felt for the first time the true cost of war. Photos of bombed hospitals, mass graves, and overcrowded shelters were seen by millions. Governments changed their rhetoric. Humanitarian organizations increased their efforts. And above all, the Ukrainian people saw that they were not alone. Someone out there saw their pain, heard their cries, and chose to show the world. But the legacy of this coverage goes far beyond the news cycle. It shows the essential role of journalism in times of crisis, to be the voice of the voiceless, to record history before it is erased. For Chernov and his team, this mission came at a cost. Deep scars, memories that can never be erased. But also pride in making a difference when it mattered most. Today, 20 Days in Mariupol is much more than a documentary. It is a lesson in courage, a historical record, and a warning for the future. It shows that even in the shadows of war, the truth can shine. If you've made it this far, it means you care. That you believe telling the truth matters. That you believe seeing, hearing, and understanding are forms of resistance. So I invite you, if this content moved you, share it. Show others what happened in Mariupol. Leave your like, comment on what you thought, and if you're not subscribed yet, click the bell icon to follow more content like this. And above all, don't let history fade away. Because as long as there are those who remember, who tell, and who listen, the truth remains alive.